Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you around the globe. Everyone who's attending today's webinar. This is the second in the series launched by the World Commission on Environmental Law. We just launched it a few weeks ago, so we're very glad you're here. My name is Denise Antolini. I'm the Deputy Chair of WCEL. I'm a Professor of Law at the University of Hawaii William S. Richardson School of Law. I will be just introducing the webinar, covering some logistics, and then turning it over to our distinguished moderator, Dr. Shayla Abed, who will start the session. So we hope that you and your families, colleagues, and communities are safe during this difficult time. We're very honored that you've chosen to take time away from your busy lives to spend the next hour and a half with us. Whether you're in a living room or your home office, whether you have kids running around your house, or like me, birds singing and roosters crowing out in my yard. We're very happy that you could attend, and we wish you all well. The World Commission on Environmental Law, or WCEL, is one of the 6 expert volunteer commissions of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. We're delighted to offer you the second in our WCEL webinar series with this session entitled, A Fresh Look at the Global Wildlife Trade. Can CITES help prevent pandemics? For our legal community, our environmental law community, both domestic and international, the topic is very timely and, as we know, urgent. The World Commission on Environmental Law is a volunteer network of environmental law and policy experts from around the world who volunteer their knowledge and services to IUCN activities and beyond. We have over 1,200 members, many of whom are attending today's webinar, which we're proud to say has over 500 people registered from all over the world. So we hope to continue to provide you news, resources, connections, and we hope that you'll become a member of WCEL. Some of you know the WCEL planned to host the second World Environmental Law Congress in Rio 2 months ago. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, like many organizations, we had to postpone that Congress. It will now be in September. You can go to our website for more information. And as many of you involved with IUCN know, the World Conservation Congress in Marseille has been postponed until January 2021. In the meantime, we have all had a lot of time to think about the challenges the world faces and how to do better, how to have a resilient future. And we're watching nature rebound in so many ways. So out of the disappointment about changes in our lives and rescheduled congresses, the World Commission on Environmental Law decided to create this webinar series as a way to engage our membership in these really important discussions, to share expertise among our members and partners, and to continue to press forward on the development of law and policy issues. So we have 2 more WCEL webinars coming up, so please watch for announcements. I just want to spend a minute on housekeeping as participants are signing in before we start. Many of you have attended many webinars or Zoom meetings, you know how it works, but some of you might be new or you might need a reminder about this format. If you are an attendee, you can type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you don't have that open, you should go down and open your Q&A box. You can type a question at any time, and we, myself and 2 other people who I'll introduce in just a second, will be handling the questions. So you won't see all the questions being asked, but we will be managing them, and as we answer them, you will see the question and the answer. So in a minute here, I'm going to fade into the background, but I want to acknowledge the tremendous assistance of 2 wonderful colleagues who will be in the background handling the Q&A and some of the logistics. Emily Gaskin, our executive officer for the commission, who is an environmental lawyer, and my colleague Christina Voigt, professor of law in Norway, who is the chair of this climate specialist group of the commission. So please be aware that we're recording today's webinar as part of our series for later posting and sharing. We'll also be keeping time so that we can have about an hour with the panelists and about 30 minutes for Q&A. Last, I must add that the views expressed today represent the views of the individual speakers, not necessarily the position of the Commission. And the webinar does not present any official position of IUCN as a whole. It is purely educational and we hope inspirational. So let me introduce my dear friend and colleague, the moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Shayla Abed. She is the Chair Emerita of the World Commission on Environmental Law and has held many distinguished positions in her long career, including as Minister of Justice of Paraguay. She's beaming in from Paraguay today, and it's a great honor for me to pass along the responsibility for managing this webinar to our moderator, Dr. Abed. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. In the last 3 months, as the world witnessed in disbelief the unleash of the pandemic, there has been a lot of discussion about the role of CITES in helping prevent zoonotic pandemics like this one. Many criticizing the so-called weak response to the health crisis, claiming that much more could have been done to address the problem. As a matter of fact, over 60% of pathogens responsible for human diseases are of animal origin, and a majority of these pathogens originated in wildlife. Rabies, Ebola, West Nile fever, avian flu, brucellosis, foot and mouth disease, malaria, leishmaniasis, dengue, to name a few. As a result, wildlife monitoring and control are critical for safeguarding biodiversity and human health. This is challenging within the current context, in which international cooperation is in its lowest point, in which we observe with horror as countries try to outbid each other for resources necessary for COVID-19, and as they fail to share information that could be crucial to combating the pandemic. It is also a time in which mistrust in the validity of multilateral agreements is in the rise. Among them, clearly, CITES, one of the first and most important environmental multilateral agreements, is being looked at. Many believe that CITES Secretariat has not met expectations with regards to positioning the agreement during this unique international context and identifying possible links between COVID-19 and the animal trade and consumption. Here it's important to note the major role that IUCN played in the origin of CITES and continuing development of it. This is why today we have 3 distinguished speakers who will give us their vision on CITES. First, I will give the virtual floor to my friend and colleague, John Scanlon, Special Envoy of African Parks and former Secretary General of CITES, who has carried out a tremendous job during his time as the Secretary General and top official of the convention, and who has lately written some interesting and guiding articles on the topic of where the CITES Secretariat should be to help bring in the transformative change we need. John, during his term, has significantly increased the level of political attention, public profile, funding, partnerships, and outreach of CITES. This includes leading global efforts to combat illegal wildlife and the creation of the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. John also signed, and this is very interesting and important, the first ever cooperation agreement between CITES and the World Animal Health Organizations. John, the virtual floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that generous invitation and introduction, Shayla. And good morning or good afternoon to you all. A big thank you also to the World Commission on Environmental Law, its chair and its deputy chair, for bringing us all together today. The COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us in a devastating way of the interconnected nature of things, most particularly between economies, the environment, human and animal health and welfare. And our international laws, programs and funds do not yet reflect this reality, which is also largely the case at the national level. IUCN commissions have been the drivers of innovation within the IUCN family, and now is a critical time for fresh thinking of what needs to be done to avert the next pandemic. And this timely webinar is focused on the role of the law in achieving this objective. Colleagues, the most likely explanation for COVID-19 is that the virus jumped from bats to humans, perhaps via another animal such as a pangolin at a wet market in Wuhan. But no firm conclusions can be drawn as yet. However, the links between wildlife and previous epidemics and pandemics are known, such as HIV/AIDS, Ebola, MERS, SARS, and more, as is the advice of public health officials and scientists on the risk posed by wildlife-related zoonotic diseases, as well as the conditions that make spillover from animals to humans more likely. The risks are real and the stakes are high. The title of today's webinar, Can CITES Help Prevent the Next Pandemic?, is a tougher question than it appears at first sight. Given its existing mandate, and I stress existing mandate, CITES' role in preventing the next pandemic is, to be frank, relatively limited in my view. And perhaps we also need to reverse the question and ask, could CITES trade expose us to the next pandemic? The answer to both questions is an understanding of how CITES works. And having seen the participant list, and it's great to have so many people involved, perhaps not everyone online shares the same understanding of CITES. So let me spend a few moments outlining some of the key aspects of the convention in very general terms. CITES is an international legal binding agreement that was adopted back in 1973, and it sets the rules for international trade in wildlife. And under CITES, when we talk about wildlife, we're talking about animals, both marine and terrestrial, and plants. The convention regulates international trade to ensure that such trade is not detrimental to the survival of the species. It does not deal with domestic trade, markets or consumption or poaching. It is about cross-border movement of wildlife. Now, CITES currently regulates international trade in around 36,000 species of wild animals and plants. And the nature of the various trade measures utilized by CITES to regulate this trade depends primarily on the biological status of the species. And commercial trade in some wild caught specimens is prohibited under CITES, and in other specimens it's allowed, but it's strictly regulated through a permit system in order to avoid overexploitation. And there is illegal trade associated both with trade that is prohibited and trade that is regulated. Now, it's important to say that CITES does not encourage, nor does it discourage trade. It regulates trade when it does take place. And it is states that determine whether or not they choose to trade in wildlife, and they can also choose to impose stricter domestic measures. And this means that they can regulate trade more strictly than CITES requires, should they choose to do so. Now, from a public health perspective, and that's what we're really focused on today, we're concerned with trade in the 30,000 plants that are listed under CITES. This includes trade in timber, like from certain rosewood species, fragrance and medicines like agarwood and the bark of the African cherry tree, and in flowers like orchids and snowdrops. Further, of the 6,000 animal species listed under CITES, there's a limited number that are of interest from a public health perspective. And as I read the science, this is mainly terrestrial mammals and birds, and possibly amphibians and reptiles. The cetaceans, the corals, the fish, the insects, the sharks, the rays, the shellfish and more, all have their issues, but from a public health perspective, not so from what I can ascertain. Now, the value and effectiveness of CITES depends upon which lens you view it from. While it has its flaws and continual improvement is needed, when viewed through the lens of avoiding overexploitation of listed species, the convention has been quite effective. This is its core mandate, which CITES parties have steadfastly adhered to. Yet the same cannot be said when the convention is viewed through the lens of public health, because CITES does not address public health issues. And the same observation can be made in relation to animal health, as well as alien invasive species, which again do not feature in CITES decision-making. Now, this is not by accident. The 183 parties to CITES have been quite consistent in keeping the focus of the convention on the biological aspects of wildlife trade in order to avoid overexploitation. However, can this rather narrow focus be sustained in a post-COVID-19 world? One that is now acutely aware of the massive damage that zoonotic pandemics can do to economies and societies across every continent, along with the call by the World Health Organization to take a One Health approach, mainly to bring public health, animal health, plant health, and the environment much closer together. CITES is not embedded into the public health or animal health discourse. And as Shayla said, as Secretary General, I tried to connect these issues back in 2016, when I signed a cooperation agreement with the World Animal Health Organization, known as OIE. Yet, while cooperation agreements between secretariats are useful, and this cooperation agreement is very useful, and it does offer an entry point for a deeper discourse, such agreements cannot change core mandates. Now, the risk to public health through wildlife-related zoonotic diseases can come from unregulated trade, regulated trade, and from illegal wildlife trade. And when looked at through a public health lens, the current system is inadequate for regulating wildlife trade, markets, and consumption that could pose a risk to public health. Left as it is, our system is not going to prevent the next pandemic. It could, in fact, be raising our potential exposure to zoonotic diseases that can spill over from wild animals to people. Profound changes are needed, and I'd like to take a few moments explaining why. CITES regulates trade in listed species, and the listing of a species is based upon trade and biological criteria. It does not include the risk to public health or animal health of such wildlife trade. For example, horseshoe bats, a likely source of the COVID-19 pandemic, are not listed, along with many other bat species which are known to harbor multiple viruses. When trade is regulated, the CITES Management Authority considers whether the traded species have been legally obtained and whether the scientific non-detrimental finding says that the trade will not be detrimental to the survival of the species. Now, if the answer to both of those questions is yes, the trade will be permitted. Under the convention, the authority is not obliged to consider the public health risk of the trade, nor the risk to animal health, or for that matter, not the risk that the species may become invasive. Now, these shortcomings with the current system have recently been highlighted in an excellent article by Dr. Jonathan Colby that's well worth a read. Now, in addition, CITES does not regulate the way the wildlife is harvested, handled, or stored in the source state, or how it is handled, stored, sold, or consumed in the destination state. Captive breeding facilities, and captive breeding now accounts for around 60% of trade in animals, are not assessed by CITES on public health grounds. Yet all of these activities I've just gone through can pose a risk factor for the emergence of zoonotic diseases. On illegal wildlife trade, in the absence of any alternative, for the 8 years I served with CITES, we worked with parties and many stakeholders to use the convention to crank up the fight against illegal wildlife trade. And we really stretched the mandate of the convention, and in doing so, we had some good success. Now here, CITES can and must continue to make an important contribution, and to do so through the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crime. But CITES has its limitations. It only applies to 36,000 of the world's 8 million species and to cross-border movement of specimens. It does not require illegal trade to be criminalized, nor does it apply to poaching. It creates management and scientific authorities, but not enforcement authorities. And it is not a natural forum for police or other enforcement officials. Our inability to really turn the corner with ending wildlife crime is perhaps best illustrated by the record levels of illegal trade in pangolins over the past 2 years, which coincided with them being given the highest level of protection under CITES. And pangolins are also a possible intermediate host of COVID-19. So what are we to do? We must finally grasp the nettle with wildlife crime, recognize the massive impacts wildlife crime has on economies, ecosystems, public and animal health, security, and local people. And with the benefit of the IPBES global assessment, we must look beyond CITES listed species and use the law to help countries stop the theft of all of their wildlife, all of the plants and animals that find their way into illegal trade, terrestrial and marine, not just those species that are on the brink of extinction. CITES was never designed to deal with wildlife crime, and it's time to embed combating serious wildlife crimes where it belongs. We must embed it into the international criminal law framework, which can be done via a protocol to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, as has been done with other serious crimes. Now, as regards wildlife trade and related laws, they must be part of a One Health approach. As I see it, there are 3 options at international level to build public health into wildlife trade laws, which could also be expanded to include animal health. We could amend CITES to include public health criteria for listing species under the convention, possibly via a new appendix and Appendix 4. We could create a new committee on public health, and we could oblige management authorities to take account of public health issues before issuing any certificate or permit. We could create a new protocol under the Convention on Biological Diversity, as has been done for living modified organisms and access and benefit sharing. Or we could create a new agreement under the World Health Organization, as has been done for tobacco control, which recognizes the serious public health consequences of tobacco. My initial preference was to look to CITES, given its existing mandate to regulate trade, as well as its well-established governance and permitting procedures. At the same time, I recognize it's a pretty big step for CITES to shift its focus after close to fears. If that option does not find favor, we also have other good options, which may even offer greater scope as they offer us the opportunity to start afresh. It is, of course, ultimately a matter for member states as to what needs to be done. But I think what is essential is that we not lose sight of the critical need to bring the world of wildlife trade, markets, and consumption together with the world of public health and animal health, which we must do if we are to avert the next wildlife-related pandemic. At the present time, states are doing this by taking stricter domestic measures to ban wildlife trade, markets, and consumption, as we've seen in China, Vietnam, Gabon, and Bolivia. We could also envisage resolutions coming from various bodies on these issues, including the UN General Assembly, the World Health Assembly, and others. However, to succeed, not just now, but into the future, we need to elevate these actions into a global forum through a new or an amended convention where open and transparent, scientifically based decisions can be taken in the collective interest to ensure we do all we can to effectively mitigate the risk, while at the same time avoiding unintended consequences. So, back to the question that was posed to me, is CITES enough or do we need more? We clearly need more. And if we manage to take these sorts of actions, I believe we will be well placed to avert the next wildlife-related pandemic. But if we do not act boldly now to institutionalize the changes that are needed to laws, as well as related funding and programs, I fear that we may find ourselves back in the same place in the not too distant future. Thank you, Sheila, and back to you.
Thank you, John. You gave us a lot of food for thought, in particularly where that the agreement core mandate as it is not obliged to see human health problems, and that we really need one health approach that will include all the health criteria, I agree with you that we need maybe another protocol under CBD or under the World Health Organization, or even modifying CITES or making another protocol. And I can clearly see, as I think a lot of people, the shortcomings of the current system. So thank you, John. And I'm happy to see all the questions coming in, and we will respond to as many as possible at the end of the panel. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Judy Wakungu, the Kenyan ambassador to France and former Environment Minister of Kenya. Thank you, Judy, for being with us today, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sheila, and thank you, fellow panelists, and I'm pleased to be here with you this evening. It's extremely important for me to state from the outset that this COVID-19 pandemic is not the last one that we shall endure. As John has stated, these zoonotic challenges are here with us, and pandemics like COVID-19 will continue. And why is this so? The more we destroy nature, the more we encroach on our protected areas, the more we decimate our biodiversity, the more we're going to expose ourselves to these opportunistic viruses. When we wantonly exploit wild species of flora and fauna, we create what has been referred to as the perfect storm of a spillover of zoonotic diseases from wildlife to people. Now, what does this mean for CITES? And what does this actually mean to the party of member states? Because CITES, as John has indicated, is just not an organization out there. It is a party of member states, about 183 of them. Quite simply, it means that business as usual may be unsustainable, and that this needs to be seriously re-examined as we go forward. This, of course, is a very difficult task, but let me remind ourselves that CITES is a powerful institution. It is ratified by 183 countries to regulate trade in species of threatened flora and fauna. But this narrow perspective or tunnel vision that we have adhered to now needs to be re-examined under the coronavirus pandemic and also future pandemics. And this re-examination must be conducted in concert with other multilateral agreements. And John has mentioned some of them, so I'm not going to repeat them. On the surface of it, it may seem odd or even callous to be discussing trade in endangered flora and fauna during a pandemic, with more pandemics on the horizon. But it presents a great opportunity for CITES and all parties to re-examine the architecture and the efficacy of CITES. Of course, as national governments, it is we that are ultimately responsible for enforcement. And this has been inconsistent in many of our countries, especially with successive changes in administration. It's important to keep in mind that trade in flora and fauna is a source of livelihood for many of our communities, on the one hand. But on the other hand, illegal wildlife trafficking or trade is a lucrative criminal and dangerous business. This means that environmental regulations must continue to be strengthened and enforced. This is the biggest investment that all parties to CITES and the mayors can make in order to play their rightful role in preventing future pandemics. I, like all of you, has tremendous respect for nature's resilience. If we step back, regeneration will occur. This is what CITES and all 183 countries must appreciate going forward. Environmental regulation and legislation must continue to be enhanced in all countries. And that this means that additional investment is urgently needed in all countries, as prevention is better than cure. Sustainability requires stewardship from all sectors and not just exploitative and use. And this puts tremendous burden on CITES to take its rightful role in preventing outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. The culture within must change, as John has referred to. The business of shifting appendices under the table through third-party regulations must also be re-examined. In other words, how do we conduct our business? We know that illegal wildlife trade and trafficking is lucrative. In fact, Interpol estimates that it could be as much as $256 billion per year. We therefore must continue also to enhance our ability to stop illegal wildlife trafficking. It means that CITES must continue to work closely with institutions or organizations like Interpol, the African Union, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and all other surveillance agencies. But at the national levels, we must step up our efforts to deter crime. Our courts must follow prosecutions to conclusion. This is the only way we can reduce our exposure to novel zoonotic pandemics. Let me close by saying, CITES is only as strong as its members want it to be. It is not a club of some are more equal than others. It is ours. CITES has a role in ensuring that we remain in harmony with nature. When we destroy the environment, we open up ourselves to colliding with viruses, and these pandemics will become more frequent. Let us remember that it is our choices and our behaviors that are driving these pandemics. This is a great opportunity for CITES to step up to the challenge. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. And I like what you said about that CITES is as strong as its members. That's very true. And we have to think about that every time. Well, now we have Professor Chin Tian Bao. He's a Luigia Professor of Law and serves as the director of the Research Institute of Environmental Law and the Associate Dean for the School of Law, Editor-in-Chief of the Chinese Journal of Environmental Law, member and Vice Chair of the Compliance Committee of the Nagoya Protocol on ABS. Professor Chin is the Vice President and Secretary General of the Chinese Society of Environmental Law, a member of IUCN CEL, and a member also of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law. Welcome, Professor, and you have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much for the kind invitation, Madam Chair, Dr. Abed. I'm very grateful for the wonderful organization of this webinar. Many thanks go to the WCL, especially to Antonio, Denise, Christian, and Emily for inviting me to speak today. I got a lot of insight from the speeches just now by Mr. Jun Scanlon and Samantha Judy Wakango. Just now, Jun have given us very clear introduction to the CITES and what it can do for the pandemic in future. I would like to join in the talk with the Judy on the role of parties to the CITES and what we can do from a party's perspective. As the just two speakers has mentioned, there are a lot of discussions right now around the whole world on the possible relationship between the public health and the trade of wildlife. Actually, the same situation in China. In this presentation, I will give you a very brief introduction to China's implementation of the CITES, its legal response to the COVID-19, and their possible international implications, and then provide several suggestions in the end. Due to the limited time, I will not go through my slide one by one, but I will share my presentations afterwards. It seems I'm the only one who has the presentation. So China is one of the mega diverse countries in the world. For example, it ranks the third in mammals, as in birds. China has also several endemic species of animals, so such as the giant panda, the Tibetan antelope, the deer, the South China tiger, and the golden monkey. Actually, as many other countries, China has more than 2,000 years of history of sustainable use of wildlife, especially for the local communities. China acceded to the CITES in 1981, almost 40 years ago. Actually, China is, the CITES is the very first MEA that China has ever joined in. After that, China has successfully implemented its obligations to the CITES and got a lot of recognition from the CITES and several other international organizations. I believe June is pleased to look at these pictures. China, for the purpose of the implementation of the CITES, China has issued a lot of laws. The most important one is the wildlife protection law and many other laws. China also established a classified protection system for wildlife. So namely the national protection class 1 and class 2, local protection and terrestrial animals, which are of important ecological, scientific and social values. So we call it animals with 3 values. So wildlife listed in the appendices of the CITES is equal to China's wildlife on the state special protection level. So namely, species in the A1 is equal to China's class 1 and A2 is equal to China's class 2. China has established its management authorities, which has 170 full-time staff with 40 branch officers in the whole China, and also scientific authorities. So here are the procedures how China regulates the scientific species and the non-scientific species. But all these are legal trade of the species. And for the purpose of combating illegal trade in China, the central government established the coordination mechanism, the National Interagency CITES Enforcement Coordination Group, consisting of 9 relevant authorities, and its updated version, the Interministerial Joint Meeting on Combating Illegal Wildlife Trade, with 25 ministries and agencies. So both mechanisms right now work very well. There are many progresses in domestic implementation of CITES in China. For example, China has carried out many special crackdown operations, conducted the capability building and awareness raising activities. So it's very interesting to mention that so every Chinese will receive a reminder mobile text message from China's 3 mobile phone companies immediately when they go abroad and land in other countries. In addition, China has undertaken a lot of cooperation with Asia and Africa countries and joined in the international cooperation operations for law enforcement, such as the Operation Cobra. So following the virus outbreak in late January, the State Forestry and Grassland Administration and 2 other ministries timely and temporarily banned the trade of wildlife, and any form of the wildlife trade domestically will be strictly prohibited on all kinds of platforms, so including the open markets and the electronic commercial sites and the supermarkets. And more important, on February 24th, the Standing Committee of National People's Congress, China's parliament, adopted a special decision to comprehensively prohibit the illegal trade of wildlife, eliminate the bad habitats of the wildlife consumption, and effectively protect the health and safety of the people. According to the decision, we can find a blacklist system, namely the food consumption of terrestrial wildlife, no matter it's bred or raised in captivity or what environment, should be prohibited. So in addition to the ban at the national level, 14 provincial parliaments passed their own bans on wildlife consumption and issued stricter regulations on wildlife trading. And internationally, China also requests the CITES Secretariat to publish a notification on its urgent measure regarding the wildlife trade regulation. So almost immediately after this ban, the national ban decision, the State Forest Administration is the competent authority in China on wildlife, issued another rules implementing the decision with stricter crackdown on wildlife hunting, illegal trading, and other activities, and resolutely ban the illegal wildlife markets. So according to the comments of several international NGOs, such as the WCS, the China's ban decision is a bigger step in the right direction, which integrated the precautionary principle into the process of amending the existing wildlife protection law and of the enacting of the new biosecurity law. So this unprecedented ban has imposed great impacts domestically. So apart from the huge unemployment and huge economic loss, there might be serious ecological and health risks arising from the final disposal of existing animals, bred animals. So for no matter it is returned to the nature or it is transferred to other legal consumption uses, or to the rescue stations, or to the final no harm treatment. So of course, China's ban will have some important international impacts. There are already several comments. For example, the traffic spokesman points out that international community might face a dilemma here. To ban the wildlife, it may risk black market or more dangerous. Or not to ban, then we need a complete and a thorough regulation. Even though, from my personal point of view, I think a ban might have more advantages. So, such as it will lower the public health risks in countries with high population density, like China and India and several other countries. And second, it will change the behavior of the general public, so not to consume the wildlife. And the size and explosion of on-the-ground market will be smaller than the current situation. Now there are two possible options for other countries. The option one is to follow China to ban the wildlife trade. As mentioned just now by Judy, that after China, Vietnam, and a few other countries has begun to ban their domestic wildlife trade also. And it is also important for other importing countries, especially for the developed importing countries, because they have more resources and the capacity to address the wildlife trade. Perhaps they should be more accountable for their roles in driving the destructive trade in the first places. But the second option is not so good. It's business as usual. So the responses from other countries in Asia, in Africa countries, in South America countries are not so encouraging. But we all understand that they engaged in the commercial scale wildlife trade, especially to Asia, to other countries. Therefore, from a global cooperation perspective, there are several challenges relating to China's ban. So number one, the ban may stimulate the wildlife trader from the importation countries, including the developed countries and the developing countries, to seek alternative destinations, such as to Africa countries, to Southeast Asia, to South America, where the wildlife trade regulation might be less stringent than China. And number two, such a ban is likely to push the trade on the ground and the potential increase the illegal wildlife trade within and among the countries in the supply chains. And number three, it is urgent time for all the parties to the CITES in general and their enforcement agencies in particular jointly to check against the laundering and to disrupt the supply of the illegal production entering one parties from another parties. So based on the above preliminary analysis, I would like to provide the following suggestions. So firstly, more countries and organizations, especially parties to the CITES, should reach more consensus on the strategies and the joint responses and action plans. And secondly, by identifying the specific causes, the trace, and the damages of wildlife trafficking, the parties to the CITES should take more comprehensive actions jointly on the whole process of the trade chain, from the very beginning poaching to the final sales. And thirdly, on the leadership or the coordination of the CITES, so all countries, including the importing countries, transiting countries, and exporting countries, and international organizations, WHO, OEI, and other regional institutions, and NGOs, so strengthening effectively coordination of effectives to make concrete progresses in combating the illegal trade of wildlife. So that is my main point based on my presentation today. I hope I did not occupy too much time, and thank you very much for your listening. I appreciate the following comments and the questions. Thank you, and it's time to the Madam Chair, the Dr. Adette. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chiambao. It was important for us that you guide us through the administrative domestic implementation of CITES and the international implications of the China ban and all the measures China is taking to the fact that you're now discussing biosecurity law. I think this is also a very important piece of legislation that will help to address some of these problems. Now we have plenty of time, so we will try. We have many questions, but I want to say thank you to Ambassador Bikumu, Chiambao, and John for sharing their thoughts and experiences with us today. It has been truly enlightening. We will now proceed to address some of the questions the webinar participants have been posting. Let me see. Well, here we have. She said, hello, very much like one of John's suggestions for possible future measures to create a global forum that is open and balanced and where scientific decisions are taken to mitigate risk from wildlife trade and human health. My question is whether there are any other discussions or moves in place right now to make this a reality. So this is for you, John.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question, and to all fellow panelists. I've thoroughly enjoyed sitting here listening myself. Yeah, we have the limitations with CITES, which we've been talking about in terms of addressing public health and animal health. Some countries, including China, and we've just heard more detail of that, have been taking stricter domestic measures to limit wildlife trade, markets, and consumption, and several other countries have done the same, which is good, and they've made decisions based upon the best advice available to them. But these risk of zoonotic diseases and pandemics are global in nature, and the opportunity for them emerge could come from any continent. So we're going to need a collective effort where we can take these sorts of decisions in an open forum like we do with CITES, for example. If a species is to be listed or not, a decision is taken in an open forum, and scientific advice is fed to the parties to the convention to help inform their decision. Given the importance of these issues, I think it's critically important we do the same sort of thing in addressing perhaps putting in place further bans or stricter regulation on wildlife trade, markets, and consumption based on public health and animal health, put it into a global forum where we can have that open and transparent decision taken. And in my brief intervention, I suggested there are three options. You could amend CITES to build that in. You could look at a new protocol under the Convention on Biological Diversity, or you could look at a new agreement under the World Health Organization. They have created a legal agreement previously and one protocol. So they are three opportunities that I would see for taking these collective decisions in an open forum based upon best scientific input. In the meantime, countries are free to take stricter domestic measures, and it's good to see that they're moving immediately. And there are also opportunities for organizations like the UN General Assembly to adopt resolutions. But as we all know, these are non-binding. They're a bit one-off. We really need to institutionalize something here, just as we did with CITES back in 1973.
Thank you, John. I have now a question for Professor Chiambao. Regarding the China ban, what is the approach to wildlife products that are consumed as part of the traditional medicine? Will they be included?
Oh, thank you. So this ban is mainly covering the consumption for eating, not for other purpose. According to the existing law, the wildlife for the traditional Chinese medicine is very limited, very restricted, limited. The uses of wildlife for the TCM, and under this current law and regulations, and the wildlife could still be used, but we need the users need some kind of permits, and they must follow the TRACE scheme. And I want to mention that in China, the TCM is traditional Chinese medicine. We use not only the wild animals, actually majority of the parts of the traditional Chinese medicine are using the herbs, the plants. So we cannot, for example, when we talk about TCM, we link it to the wild animals. Actually, majority of them are using the plants with the herbs. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. There is a question for Judy, and says, one concern regarding prohibition of consume of wildlife is related to the traditional uses of these things by indigenous communities. How do you think we can replace these as means of living, in particular, for example, in Africa?
That's a very good question, because it's a question that when it comes to our laws usually have a framework that includes, for example, people that consider themselves indigenous people or people that are forest dwellers. Usually that is taken care of and catered for in the law. Now, that is also subject to regional laws in different countries. Many provisions are being made by many countries. I can give you the example of Kenya, to incorporate people that have been traditionally marginalized and incorporate them into the mainstream society by providing opportunities for education, by providing opportunities for those that are living with wildlife to also benefit from that wildlife. In Kenya, there's also a law on benefit sharing. These are not written in stone, but I know that there are many countries, when it comes to their legal mechanisms, are also looking into these opportunities. Many of these grievances have even been taken up to the AU court, the African Union court, for example. So even as we speak, many countries are in the process of amending or enhancing their laws in order to incorporate the participation and the rightful place of people that are considered indigenous or forest dwellers, people living with wildlife, so that they are not completely marginalized. But most importantly, we see them really as the first beneficiaries of living with our flora and fauna.
Thank you, Judy. This is a question for all three panelists. Given that COVID-19 is not the first zoonotic disease, but markedly the one with the greatest and most notable impacts on human health in recent times, do you think we now have goodwill to drive the amendments of CITES or possible ratification of a One Health protocol under an enabling convention? Any of you?
I'm happy to go first. Yeah, this pandemic is like nothing else we've ever experienced, and the loss of life, the loss of livelihoods, the extraordinary social and economic cost of this pandemic have affected everyone. My view would be that there is an appetite for doing what we can to ensure this doesn't happen again. because similar circumstances could arise in so many different places, in so many different ways, if we allow the status quo to prevail. So my sense is there is a strong sense the status quo will not cut it. We cannot just stay with business as usual, I think, as other panelists have said. So we have to look at what is it that we need to do as an international community to make sure we don't find ourselves in the same position again. And today, and thanks to the innovation of the Commission on Environmental Law, we've had a chance to discuss some options, because the international legal framework is deficient. It is deficient in how it deals with unregulated wildlife trade, regulated wildlife trade, and illegal wildlife trade when viewed from a public health and an animal health perspective. And while we've had the advice of public health officials and scientists before, I think there's no doubt in anyone's mind now that we must act here. So I would say the goodwill is there, but states, and as Judy said, it is states, countries that will determine the international legal framework. And we as an international community here, or a community of interest, need to present states with some options that they can consider as options that could help prevent this pandemic. And I think that's what we've been discussing today. So I think now is probably the best moment we'll ever have to make changes, either to CITES or to have a protocol dealing with wildlife crime, or to have a new agreement on public health and animal health aspects of wildlife trade, consumption, etc. Because you'd say if we're not prepared to move now, I can't see another circumstance that would present itself like this. You know, we have to move. We really have no option here. We have to make changes. We've seen the gaps, we've seen the deficiencies. I think we know what we can do to fill those gaps. So let's, as a global community, work together and put in place what we need to make sure we're not stuck in this same position anytime in the future.
We have to keep with the momentum, that's right. Now we have a question for Professor Tian Bao. Does China's ban on the wildlife trade make any distinction between wildlife consumption and other interactions that pose health risks and well-established hunting and fishing practices with long-term safety records? In other words, does the law make any distinction between types of wildlife?
Yes, so this is a very good question. I just typed several words in the box. Yes, right now the ban is to prohibit the illegal trade of wildlife, but now the ban actually expands to all kinds of wildlife. Before we have a similar ban already, but this ban is limited to the wildlife stipulated in the wildlife protection law. But this time, this ban including almost all kinds of terrestrial wildlife. But the fisheries is a different situation. As the question mentioned, the fishery with long-term safety record has been excluded from this blacklist. But this ban did not include the trade for other purposes. For example, for the TCM or the scientific research. But all this kind of the illegal trade must be under strict regulation of the quarantine requirement. So both the wildlife protection law and the animal quarantine law requires the quarantine steps. So all this legal trade of this wildlife should follow this quarantine requirement and several other regulation measures. So these two aspects. One is for the totally ban on eating the wildlife, but strict regulations on other legal trade of wildlife. I hope I answered the question. Madam Chair. I answered the question.
Thank you, Chambao.
Yeah.
I have another question here that is kind of the. There is another question, like in the same sense. Were any of the wild species available at the Wuhan wet market, particularly fruit bats, sold legally?
Firstly, I don't think we have the kind of wildlife market at least. I have been in the city for more than 26 years. I never heard about their wildlife market in this city, and I did not realize that the people around me like to eat the animals, the wildlife animals, and we do have some kind of open market, or someone call it a wet market. So the wet market is very popular in China, in many other the Asia, East Asia countries. So this is kind of open markets. They sell the fresh meat or fresh vegetable or several other daily things. So I'm not so sure because, you know, China's so big and we have many the open markets around, but we have very limited the human resources. The competent authorities actually they have sometimes they have a limited human resources and have limited the technical capabilities to check if this part or this meat are from the wild environment or from the bred situation. So that's the possibility that why this kind of wildlife come to the market. But till now, we still do not have sufficient scientific evidence to prove that this COVID-19 come from this market, because many articles right now said only maybe lower than the 30% of the patients of the COVID-19 have some kind of relationship with the market. So maybe it's not the situation. I mean, the original case from this market. So this is still needed the further scientific research. But we hope to do that. But according to me, that this is very important, as just now Joe mentioned also that China's ban on the consumption is from the perspective of precautionary principle. Even we have no the scientific research certainties right now, but China still do something to prevent the possible future possible outbreak again. So I think this approach is very important. So this is the bigger step for China's parliament of China's wildlife law right now to the ban to incorporate the idea of the public health into the wildlife protection law. I'm not so sure it's the one of the first wildlife laws have the public health consideration or not, but I think at least some. I mean, China is maybe one of the earliest countries to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. This is a question for John. How much of an impact is the growing tension between world powers from a global non-wildlife trade perspective and growing nationalism going to play into how we are able, as a global community, going to come together to be able to move what you are talking about forward meaningfully?
Thanks, and I think we're all aware there's some tension in the air, but at the same time, I think there is a collective will to try and find ways and means of avoiding this happening into the future. I'm heartened by the fact when I go back in history, if you go back to 1972, when we had the UN conference on the human environment, when UNEP was created, we had CITES 73, we had Ramsar 73 World Heritage. That was in the middle of the Cold War. And despite the fact we were in the middle of the Cold War at that time, we managed to have that conference, create the UN Environment Program based in that beautiful city of Nairobi, Kenya, where I once lived. We created CITES, which is a very, a strong convention, along with the others, Ramsar World Heritage and Migratory Species. So what we've seen historically, despite the fact there may be some geopolitical tensions, underlying that there has been the capacity for the international community to negotiate very robust agreements. They're a good set of agreements that came through in the 70s, albeit they need updating in 2020. So I'm hopeful that we'll see the same collaboration emerge here, because it's in all of our collective interest that we make reforms to ensure that we're not in the same position together. And that's a point of common interest. I do think, and that's why I'm so happy that you put on this webinar, we do as a community of interest here that want to offer solutions. We need to come together and offer opportunities, suggest ideas that can be picked up by states if they're interested, and find ways and means forward.
Thank you, John. It will be really challenging. There is a question for Ambassador Bikumu from Mr. Ebenezer from Nigeria. He says, I'm an environmental lawyer, and most of international treaties are not effectively implemented, including CITES, especially in developing countries. How do you think countries can effectively implement wildlife trade, especially when there is no mechanism on ground for its effective implementation in such countries?
This is a very straightforward question from, I think, my brother in Nigeria. I didn't hear whether it was a brother or a sister. It all depends on political will. That is all it depends. When we ratify these international treaties, it actually means that we've also embedded them in our own national laws. And so it is up to each and every single person, and yourself as an environmental lawyer must then now look up to your legislators, go to your Minister of Environment and other ministers to ensure that these laws are enacted. I did it myself for 5 years, and I managed to enact several laws which hadn't been done before. Now that was considered a record, but it's because I had the leadership, I had the advice, I had the support right from the top, but then also we had very good support from the Parliament and also from the Senate. These are your representatives. You advise them as an environmental lawyer. You can even speed it up by coming up with amendments to existing laws. And then, as per requirement, have public participation. Go around the country and get support from all Nigerian citizens, in this case, and then ask them to appeal also to their legislators to make these amendments. The reason this is important is because we don't know what challenge we're going to be faced with tomorrow. We cannot have the perspective that we used to have in the past, that these laws or pieces of legislation are written in stone. In fact, my approach is to say, once the piece of legislation or the bill has passed through Parliament and then now has been assented to by the head of state, as soon as the head of state has assented to that bill, it's actually now obsolete, and you have to begin the amendments again, just to keep up with the new changes of the dynamic world. So my encouragement to you is be loud, draft the legislations yourself if you can. We have always worked very closely with Nigeria. I remember during my tenure, I worked very closely with your then Minister of Environment, my sister Amina J. Mohammed, who is now, of course, Deputy Secretary General. It is possible, and I encourage you to do it. If you are stuck, just call us and we'll continue working together. But it is possible, and I encourage you to keep amending those laws and to keep looking at the efficacy of those laws.
I think it's very good to repeat Judy's encouragement for all participants to take action in their own arena. It's up to everyone.
Yes.
And we have a question for Dr. Chin. Professor Chin, the recent Chinese trade ban and consumption of wildlife products is likely to stimulate illegal trade. How deterrent are the laws to control the illegal trade and consumption which might come out as a result of the ban?
Okay, yeah, it's also a very good question. Actually, for good or well enforce the ban, it is very important to combat the illegal trade. Right now, as we have at least two approaches. One is domestic, next is international. Domestically, China's the ban itself has stimulated the criminal responsibilities. So, namely, anyone who violates who have criminal punishment. So the China's the enforcement department has joined together to combat the illegal trade after the ban was released. Second is internationally. So it is not enough for China alone to ban the illegal trade. I think it's very important to several other countries, especially other, the countries in the supply chain, to do something similar or the same jointly. So only so we can, completely combat this illegal trade to combat the black markets. Thank you.
Then we have a question for anyone. The trade in respect of why, but first of all, diseases to arise, sufficient to have practices that are interactions with or consumption of wildlife domestically. Then a new strain of disease would spread infected humans without any trade of wildlife. How could this be addressed?
Sorry, I cannot hear the question very well. The sound very bad just now.
Okay, we have been discussing the trade implications in respect of wildlife, but for zoonotic diseases to arise, it could be sufficient to have practices that allow interaction with or consumption of wildlife domestically. Then a new strain of disease could spread through international travel by infected humans without any trade of wild animals. How could this be addressed?
It's a good question about whether or not, or how you deal with zoonotic diseases that emerge purely through domestic trade or domestic consumption. So there's no international dimension to it until the disease goes out of the country. It's a good question, and as I said earlier, CITES doesn't deal with domestic trade, it's dealing with international trade. As we look forward to what sort of regime we need looking forward, I do believe we need something that goes beyond just international trade, but is also able to look at certain domestic issues, including markets and consumption, because it's not always got that international dimension in terms of the emergence of that. Now that's going to be a little bit challenging, and one would have to work very hard on negotiations to see how you struck the right balance in getting the language right and in a way that countries felt confident with recognizing issues of state sovereignty. I do, however, believe that there is an opportunity here to craft the right language, taking a One Health approach, which is bringing together public health, animal health, the environment, wildlife, trade, both domestic and international. So I do believe we have a window there, but I think any regime we put in place to combat or to avert the next pandemic is going to have to address domestic issues as well as international issues.
Well, thank you. We have had more than 45 questions that have been as many as 30 has been privately addressed on your chat box. But I have a question that was posed by one of the participants that I think it's a very good question to be like the last question of this webinar. It is 10 years in the future. Where do you see the world situation on illegal wildlife trade in 2030? What is the same and what has changed and why? And I would like every one of you to answer this question.
Let me just start by saying that 10 years in the future, we'll be better at conserving our environment because of what we have learned from this particular pandemic. For many of us who've struggled on the ground, it is now understood what it is that we've been fighting for. I think organizations like CITES might have an Appendix 4, as John has suggested. I don't think there's appetite now to have a new international organization. First, the structure, the management, the administration, and then also the financial constraints, because it's going to take us some time to get out of this particular pandemic. I see our regional institutions 10 years from now also being stronger in working together in terms of transboundary and across boundaries, and these will also extend into international cooperation. I see in terms of the legal environment in our countries being very strong. I see the judiciary and the executive and the legislators working more closely and working more in harmony to safeguard not only our biodiversity, our environment, but also to make those connections with the dangers that we expose ourselves to public health. That is what I see in future.
John?
Thank you. Thanks for that, Judy. I think that in 2030, we'll look back at 2020 as having been a defining year when we recalibrated our relationship with nature and with wildlife. And we woke up to ourselves to realize that we could not keep doing things the way we were. And I think what we're going to see, and we're going to look to 2030, we will have adopted a new approach, either it's amendments to CITES or a new agreement to have a One Health approach to wildlife trade, markets and consumption. And this is looking at the animals in trade that can have a public health risk. We saw that come together, and we saw that come together through a new agreement or an amended agreement. I think in 2030, we will have also seen the Convention on Biological Diversity having adopted a far-reaching plan to 2030 that picked up on all the recommendations on the IPBES report, gave us a roadmap forward for wider efforts at nature conservation. And I think we also finally in 2020 decided we're going to bite the bullet on dealing with wildlife crime to stop countries having their wildlife stolen, where organized crime is benefiting at the expense of local communities and ecosystems. We put in place a protocol under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, got police, prosecutors and the justice system hot on the tail of these wildlife criminals and drove them out of business. So I feel optimistic towards 2030. We completely reformed the international legal landscape to fill the gaps. We had an inspired vision from the Convention on Biological Diversity on 2030. And we took account of the lessons from COVID-19 pandemic and the recommendations out of IPBES.
Professor?
Yeah, I fully agree with the words by Judy and June. And it is very important to mention that the year 2020 is very special for all of us, especially for our environmental lawyers. I do believe that in 2030, we will have a much better situation than right now. And we all know that we can learn something from this kind of risk or this kind of dangers. We can find some opportunities to improve ourselves. For example, this time we all over the world have realized the importance to protect the environment, to protect the wildlife. Before this webinar, I have seen several videos. We can see the wild animals walking on the street in many cities. So this is kind of, we can say perhaps this kind of a pandemic is kind of self-adjustment of the nature, and to give the people, the human being, to understand we should keep the living space. We should protect the habitats of the wildlife. And for the lawyers, we have learned a lot from the past experience or lessons, and we do believe no matter at the domestic level or international level, we can promote the legislation and the enforcement, and we can also promote the collaboration, coordination, and synergies among the different organizations and the different MES, or even the environmental agreements with health agreements. Maybe you have also knowing the Chinese saying that the Chinese traditional philosophy is be harmony with the nature. The human being must be harmony with nature, of course, including the wildlife. So I believe we will have a bright future in 2030. Thank you.
It's really clear the path forward. We all need to do our share. And the future of international law will be only all the inside to promote the One Health approach that will take all the things we have gone through today. Well, it was my pleasure leading this, moderating this panel. Thank you everyone for participating, the incredible panelists, and I thank IUCN for promoting this kind of webinars. They are very useful to start working during this pandemic on the way forward. So thank you everyone. And don't forget to sign up for the next week's seminar, which will be on May 28. It will be in Spanish on the legal tools to combat this pandemic. I will ask now Denise Antolini that will do some housekeeping about where we can find the documents, the presentations regarding this webinar. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Shayla, and all the participants. For everyone who is still on and for everyone who is registered, you will receive an email thanking you for participating, and also with information about where the PowerPoint and the recording will be posted. So thank you for your patience. It will all be coming to you, as well as the announcements about the future webinars. And as the Deputy Chair of WCEL, on behalf of the Commission, I'm very pleased to thank our moderator, our panelists. It was an excellent global discussion, and we know we must continue to work extremely hard on this issue. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to officially close the seminar. Thank you. Aloha.
Aloha.